Right from the inception of the British takeover of the First Nations lands of Australia, there has been a struggle over the rights of Indigenous peoples within the framework of the introduced British political and legal systems. Over time, there have been many petitions from Aboriginal people to Australian parliaments and attempts to present petitions to the Crown. Here's a petition in 1846 from the Indigenous people of Tasmania who had surrendered and been removed to Flinders Island. They sought some control over their lives by petitioning the Governor and then the Queen to protest the appointment of a cruel protector. Many attempts by Aboriginal people to gain equal rights to other British subjects and Australian citizens continued over the colonial period and into nationhood, but such efforts have been continually refused. The efforts by Aboriginal people for equal rights also included organised activism. On the 26th of January 1938, the 150th anniversary of the British colonisation of Australia, Aboriginal people held a protest called the Day of Mourning. This protest was organised by the Aborigines Progressive Association and Australian Aboriginals League. These groups had sent petitions to the Australian government and the British government calling for citizen rights for Aboriginal people, but these had been refused. So it was decided that a more proactive event would be held, which governments and the media could not ignore. The protest became a tradition, and Aboriginal people and their supporters have held a day of mourning or a vigil on this day ever since. Such efforts to gain equal rights for Aboriginal people were vital given the dire circumstances the state had forced them into. Here's the situation for Aboriginal people as late as the 1960s. Aboriginal people's lives were still controlled by the Aboriginal protection boards, which decided where they could live, where they could work, what they could spend their wages on, who they could marry, who they could socialise with, where they could travel to. Aboriginal people were forbidden to drink alcohol and were denied entry to pubs, restaurants, milk bars, swimming pools, pretty much anywhere any white man wanted to deny them. Many Aboriginal people were denied the right to vote. Aboriginal people had no right to own property, denying their ownership of their own lands, but also denying them the great Australian dream of owning your own home, highlighting their position on the fringes of Australian society. But the 1960s saw pressures for change around the world, with the spotlight on racial politics in South Africa, the civil rights movement in the US, and influential people like Martin Luther King. In 1965, Aboriginal activist Charles Perkins, one of the first Aboriginal people to graduate from university, organised 30 Sydney University students to undertake a freedom ride. They travelled to Walgett, Moree, Bowraville and Kempsey to protest against discrimination and poor living conditions. They rode through these country towns, swam in segregated pools, showed Aboriginal people that they could and should be entitled to equal treatment within Australia. Indigenous people began to organise politically across Australia in larger and larger numbers to advocate for change. Part of the Aboriginal resistance, part of their efforts on their own behalf for recognition of their rights in their own land was the Bark Petition, which you might have seen on display in Parliament House in Canberra. The Yolngu people from Yirrkala in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory sent the petition to the Commonwealth Parliament in August 1963. These are the first documents bridging Commonwealth law and the Indigenous laws of the land. Petitions to Parliament must conform to certain rules of procedure, and the acceptance of these petitions marks a bridge between two traditions of law. But there was still a long way to go. The political organisation of Aboriginal people in the 1960s began to get some traction. Legislation in 1962 gave Aboriginal people the vote in federal elections. Queensland was the last state to allow this in 1965. Then in 1967, a referendum was put to the Australian people to give the Commonwealth power to make laws specifically for Aboriginal people and to count them when determining the national population. The Australian people showed their resounding support with a yes vote of 90%, the largest yes vote in the history of referendums. But Aboriginal rights were more than just about the vote in the census. A connection to their land is central to traditional law, integral to Aboriginal spirituality, vital to their well-being. And so for Indigenous people, so much effort on their own behalf has centred on achieving rights to their own land. In 1966, 200 Gurindji stockmen and their families walked off the Wave Hill cattle station, 800 kilometres from Darwin, in protest against poor working and living conditions. While beginning as a strike, demands soon centred on the return of their traditional lands to the Gurindji people. The strike went on until 1975 with a change of government and a change of ideas. In 1975, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam handed Wave Hill back to its traditional owners. During the ceremony, Whitlam famously poured a handful of sand into the hands of Gurindji activist leader Vincent Lingari. A wave of land rights legislation followed, but it was court-made law that was to have the most profound effect. That was the now famous Mabo decision. In 1992, Indigenous peoples' prior occupation and connection to the land was recognised by the High Court of Australia's Mabo judgment. The Mabo versus Queensland case was brought by Torres Strait Islander Eddie Koiki Mabo in his fight to change land laws to recognise Indigenous connection and traditional ownership of land in Australia. He worked on the Mabo case for 10 years, but unfortunately passed away just months before he could learn the High Court's decision on his legal battle. I actually went to uni with Eddie Mabo Jr., an amazingly charismatic character, probably very like his father. The High Court recognised that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have rights to the land, rights that existed before the British arrived, rights that can still exist today. Finally, terra nullius was no more. And so we see Aboriginal people's efforts to be heard, their hopeful representations on their own behalf to be afforded the equal rights of all citizens within Australia, have a history as long as British colonisation of their country. A lot of it has been wound back by successive governments since then, but a lot of people still keep going with hope in their hearts. In 2017, the leaders of many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities came together in the Constitutional Convention and gave to the Australian people the Uluru Statement from the Heart. They said, "We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future." But again, the government turned their backs. Is such a refusal by government representative of the will of we the people? Do you support the First Nations peoples of Australia in their efforts for voice, treaty, truth? Perhaps you'll take their hand and support their activism. I'm Diane Colman. All the best.